Let's start Lab 200 by logging into the Oracle Cloud, your cloud account name, along with your username and password. Once logged into the OCI console, let's navigate to Platform Services Developer. Let's access the AppDev instance URL. Once here, let's validate that our OCI account credentials are still valid. Now we're going to create a virtual machine template. This virtual machine template will include the following software. Let's add Docker, kubectl, OCI CLI. Let's add Python, SQL CLI, let's click Done. Now that the template's been created, let's define a virtual machine which leverages this template. Select the appropriate region. Here we're going to select a VM standard 2.1 for the shape. Let's click Add. Now that our virtual machine's been created, let's create your first project. For now, this will be an empty project. This will take several minutes to complete provisioning. Now that the project's been created, let's add two repositories. One for the product service and the other one for the user service. Here we will import an existing repository. Let's navigate back to the project home. Let's add a second repository. And again, this one will be leveraging an existing repository which will be imported. Now that the repositories have been created, we need to configure some of the files within the repositories. The files will include the product service secret YAML file along with the user server secret YAML file. These files will include base64 encoded values for the database username, password, and database URL. To encode these values, we're going to start an Oracle Cloud Shell, and we're going to execute the following commands. And as we execute them, we'll copy them and save them for use later. Now let's navigate back over to Visual Builder Studio. Let's select the product service Git. Let's edit the product service secret YAML file. Let's select it and then click the Edit button. Here we'll replace the values with the newly base64 encoded values we just created. Be sure to commit your changes, and also remember to do the same for the user service secret YAML file within the user catalog Git repository. Once this is updated, be sure to commit your changes. And now we're going to update the app YAML file within both the product catalog and user catalog service Gits. Here we'll update the image URL to include the appropriate region, storage namespace, In our case, we're using IAD, which is Ashburn, and then we'll need to change the namespace to match the object storage namespace we selected earlier. And be sure to do this for both the product catalog Git and the user catalog Git. Lastly, remember to commit your changes. Now that we've made all the changes to our Git repositories, we're going to navigate over to the build section, and we're going to create a build job. This job will contain a series of steps which will generate the containers within Kubernetes. Once the job's been created, let's associate a Git repository with the job. In this case, we're going to select the product catalog service Git. Now we're going to add some steps to this build job. So let's click on the Steps tab. Let's add our first step. Our first step will be an OCI CLI. Here we'll provide the user OCID along with the fingerprint, the tenancy OCID, the private key in PEM format, which we generated earlier in the workshop, and be sure to select the appropriate region. Now we're ready to add a second step. But first, we're going to switch back over to the OCI console, and we're going to navigate to our Autonomous Transaction Processing database, where we're going to collect the OCID for the product database. Click the Copy option and use this in the next build step. So let's click Add Step. We're going to add a Unix shell step. And in this Unix shell step will be an OCI command, an OCI CLI command, which will retrieve the wallet from the Autonomous Transaction Processing database product. Next, we're going to navigate back over to the OCI console, and we're going to generate a second authorization token for use in the next build step, which will be a Docker login. So let's enter the appropriate description. Click the Generate Token button, and be sure to click Copy. We'll navigate back over to Visual Builder Studio, and we'll add the next step, which will be a Docker login. Here we're going to enter the appropriate registry host. Be sure to enter the correct region. We'll enter the username, which includes the namespace and username. And the password will be the authorization token. Next, we're going to navigate back over to the OCI console. We're going to access the developer area and select registry. And we're going to create two public repositories, which will hold the images for our product and user catalog services. These repositories will be made public. Now we're going to navigate back over to the Visual Builder Studio. We're going to add another step for Docker build. Here, this will build the images, which will later be pushed to the OCIR registry. Once the build is done, we'll add a step for Docker push. And lastly, let's navigate back over to the OCI console to the OKE section. Here we'll navigate to our cluster. We'll click on the Access Cluster button and we'll copy the kubeconfig commands. Once copied, let's navigate back over to Visual Builder Studio. And let's add a step for Unix shell. And this will build the Kubernetes containers. Let's save our build job. Now that the build job has been configured, let's click the Build Now button. This will take a few minutes to start. Once completed, we can navigate over to the build log and verify that we had a successful build. If we scroll to the bottom, we'll see our container running with an IP address, along with a successful command or status. Now let's navigate back over to the build area again. We're going to create a second job for the user service. Here we're going to copy our first build we just created. This will save us time. Let's select the Docker product build. Once created, we need to now edit some of the steps. But first, we need to select the appropriate Git. So let's change it from the product catalog Git to the user catalog Git. Let's click on the steps. Here we need to change the OCID from the product catalog autonomous instance to the user catalog autonomous instance. We'll change the name here for the wallet file to user. Be sure to change it in both places. Let's also change the name of the image from product to user. Again, that's in two places as well. And lastly, let's change from the product service secret YAML to the user service secret YAML file. Be sure to click the Save button. Now we're ready to execute our build. Let's click Build Now. Once completed, we can navigate over to the build log. Scroll to the bottom, we'll see the user service container running with an IP address along with a successful command. And that concludes Lab 200. Let's move on to Lab 300.